We've been in a series all month about people who have had encounters with Jesus. And I just want to start out by saying, no matter how long you've been in the church, or maybe you don't know anything about Jesus, this is true for you. Jesus wants to have an encounter with you. He's not hiding. He wants to be found, and it will absolutely change everything. We started out the series by saying that all of us long for an encounter with something divine. I want to tell you that's what the experience of following Jesus is meant to be. You can't read the stories of Jesus and not find that. A few years ago, Janine and I were living in Michigan, and some of you know it because you've been around for a while, but some of you haven't even met me or Janine before. If we haven't met, my name's Dan. I'm the pastor here. But before we lived in Yakima, over 3.5 years ago, we moved here on October 18th, 2020. Before that, we lived in the southwest rural area of Michigan. And I had been in ministry for over a decade, full-time church ministry. But it got to a point where I was really just kind of feeling done. And I thought there's got to be a little bit more than what I'm doing. And I didn't really like where I was. And so we had left one position and we went to another church, and we thought maybe we'll do some church planting. We'll start a church. And we got 1.5 years in that process, and we thought, no, I don't think this is it either. But we didn't know what was. And so we walked away from the position we were in, and we sold our house. We moved to Lake Michigan for the summer. And if you've never been to Lake Michigan, it's like an ocean, but nothing will eat you, and it's warmer in the summer months. So no salt water, it's fresh, it's good beaches. So we were like, if we're going to be in Michigan over the summer, where do we want to be? Lake Michigan. So we moved, we rented a house for the summer, and we committed for a month just to do nothing in terms of trying to figure out our situation other than pray and rest. And so we did that, and we fasted, and we prayed. And as we were praying, we did something called listening. Okay, we're not, I had to say it that way because we don't usually listen. We like to talk, but we're not always the best at listening. So we listened. Listen to what? Well, Janine and I are a bit crazy. We think that every single person ever created, has ever lived, has the ability to hear from the Lord. It might take a little bit of practice, and you might need to learn how to do it, but you can hear from the Lord. And so we listened for the voice of God. We listened for him to see what he would say to us during this rest time. And as the month progressed, we just rested into the presence of God. We had significant and meaningful and sometimes even emotional moments in prayer with God. We fasted. And on the other side of things, we found that we needed to get up and we needed to move to Yakima, Washington. And it's been great because in the process, we learned some things. We learned as we listened that God spoke about who we were, what we were created to do, and the purpose he has for us. And I'll tell you what, I went from, should we even be working in a church anymore, to having a doubled down version of conviction and certainty that this next phase is absolutely what God has for us. We got this renewed purpose and calling from the Lord. And so we made our way out here about almost 4 years ago now. And we've never been the same. It's been a beautiful experience. I tell you, the most beautiful thing about it, though, was having this renewed sense of calling, this renewed sense of purpose. Purpose is a unique thing. It's something that we all long for. Author and speaker Donald Miller says this about purpose and meaning. Every human being is searching for a deep sense of meaning, and yet we're all chasing success. We've confused one for the other. You see, what Miller points out is that we all have this longing for success, but somewhere in us, we don't slow down and think about where that meaning is coming from, and so we just start to equate it with busyness and success. And that's what we pursue in our lives. We get stuck there. But we get stuck there because we're after something. We're after something called meaning and purpose. Now, there's been talk of meaning and purpose for generations, for millennia. As long as human beings existed, I think we were drawn to some level of purpose and meaning. Here's a few people starting from the most recent and working back, not super far, but a little bit. And they don't follow Jesus. These aren't faith-filled quotes. These aren't Bible quotes. These are just everyday people quotes that show and speak to the longing of purpose and meaning that we have in our lives. Simon Sinek says, most of us live our lives by accident. We live it as it happens. Here's the powerful part. Fulfillment comes when we live our lives on purpose. Right? Just like Donald Miller points out, we can have this pursuit of something, but it isn't until you refine it. You're not going to be satisfied. There's not the fulfillment that comes until we live out a life of purpose and meaning. Mark Twain, some of you have heard of him before, said this, and maybe you've even heard this quote before. The two most important days in your life are the day you are born and the day you find out why. You know, you and I have no control over our existence in the world. We have no control or say over our being in the world. However, there's a significant moment when we find purpose. And ironically, Friedrich Nietzsche said this: whoever has a reason to live will almost always find out how. The how always follows the why. We need the why. Now, it's said that there's a few questions that everybody throughout time, space, and history will wrestle with in their lives. It's these three questions, or at least some version of these three questions. Who are we? Where are we from? And where are we going? You see, at a human level, all of us will wrestle with some version of these three questions. Who are we? Where are we from? And where are we going? It speaks to our identity, and it speaks even more to where we're going. It's our purpose. It's the meaning. Why are we here? What are we doing? What are we after? Some of the deepest wrestlings people ever do is from these questions. We long for meaning. We crave meaning. Life is filled with meaning, and there's different levels of meaning. There's meaningful work that we can do, but there's also significant life-altering meaning. And what if there's a way that we can step into a deeper sense of purpose and calling? I want to turn to Luke chapter 5 today. If you have your Bible, you can turn to Luke chapter 5. If you don't have a Bible with you, that's fine. We're going to have it up on the screen, and we're going to read about an encounter that Simon has with Jesus. Now, we're reading from the book of Luke. Luke was a follower of Jesus, but not till later. Luke actually learned to follow Jesus by following followers of Jesus. And along the way, he had compiled a really orderly account, a really good account of a biography of Jesus, and he laid out all of the stories that he had been learning. And so he tells this one from some of Jesus's first followers. We start in verse 1. One day, as Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, the people were crowding around him and listening to the word of God. He saw at the water's edge 2 boats left there by fishermen who were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from shore. Then Jesus sat down and taught the people from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master," I emphasized the wrong word, Simon answered, "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything, but because you say so, I will let down the nets." When they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them, and they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man." For he and his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken. And so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on you will fish for people." So they pulled their boats up on shore, left everything, and followed him. Now, as we've been reading encounters with Jesus, this one's a little bit different. It's a different type of encounter. In the other encounters, we saw people get healed, or we saw incredibly beautiful things. And this is a beautiful story, but it's a different kind of beautiful. Now, when we get into it, we see Jesus, and he's at the Lake of Gennesaret, And he's in the area of Capernaum. And Capernaum ended up becoming Jesus' hometown. Once he left his family and started ministry, Capernaum was the place where it was like his home base. And it was the place where a lot of his followers lived. And so Jesus is in that area. He taught a whole lot in that area. And one of the days, he's teaching by the lake. And there's so many people crowding around him, we read in verse 1, that they were pushing against him, and he couldn't get any space. And so he backs up to the edge of the water. And in the water, he notices two boats. He notices the guys who had been fishing in the boats. They were out cleaning their nets. And so he gets into one of the boats, and he looks at Simon, who becomes Peter later on. Maybe you've heard of one of Jesus' followers called Peter. His name originally was Simon. Jesus redefined him and changed his name. And so right now we see it's Simon's boat, and Jesus gets into the boat. In verse 2 we read, he saw at the water's edge two boats left there by fishermen who were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from shore. Then he sat down and taught the people from a boat. Now, Simon's a fisherman. That's pretty clear. It's probably late morning. He's already done his fishing. He's cleaning his nets, and Jesus is teaching. Simon's a fisherman. Jesus is what's called a rabbi. A rabbi was a wandering, itinerant preacher. They would teach on the Jewish scriptures, what we call the Old Testament. Jesus taught on, rabbis would teach on, and they would go from place to place, and they would sit down, and they would teach on the words of God, and then they would be asked questions. And that's what Jesus does here. He gathers people out by the lake, but there's so many, and they push against him that he gets into the boat. Now, I grew up in not just near a lake shore, but also we had a lot of inland lakes, just like we do here, and some of the lakes in the morning were just absolutely clear, like as smooth as glass. And I always found it curious that you could hear the people who were having coffee on the other side in the morning, in the stillness of the morning. They'd just be sitting on their decks having coffee and talking in a normal voice, not even as loud as I'm talking. And you could hear them all the way across the lake. And I'd always look around like, where is that coming from? And then I'd see, all the way across the small lake, I'd see a small couple of dots sitting on a porch. And I'd realize that I can hear them better than I can see them. There was this capacity for water, and Jesus understood that, so he kind of turns the area not into just having a little bit of distance from the crowd, but he also uses it as kind of a vocal amplifier and auditorium so that he could continue teaching, and that's just what he does. He gets in the boat, he looks at Simon, who's in the middle of his work, and I don't know about you, but if Jesus had looked at me while I was in the middle of my work and asked me to stop and do something else, and I didn't know who Jesus was, I'd think, This is okay. This is mildly frustrating. I have a task list. I have to get it done. I'm tired. Simon's already been out all night. We'll find out in a second. And Jesus says, Simon, get in the boat with me and let's go out a little bit. Stop what you're doing. Let's go. Now there was a certain level of honor associated with rabbis. They were honored and listened to. They were respected. And so Simon does that. Simon gets in the boat with Jesus. And Jesus sits down and teaches the people. Then we read in verse 4 that when he had finished speaking, he's all done with his teaching, he looks at Simon and he says this, "Put out to deep water and let down the nets for a catch." Now again, Simon's already cleaning the nets, right? At the very least, this is a mild annoyance. He's going to have to clean those nets again. And I think he has this moment where he's looking at Jesus and he's thinking, you're a rabbi. You teach God's words. You don't know anything about fishing. Like when it comes to the Bible, all right, I'll listen to you. But when it comes to fishing, maybe you should listen to me. Right? I think that's only human. So Jesus says this to Simon, and Simon answers him, "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything." Like that's pretty obvious, right? Like now I did a little bit of fishing when I was younger. I don't do a lot of fishing. You could also say that I don't fish now at all. But there's a lot of river fishing around here. It was a lot of small lake fishing growing up. It was like I was a worm and bobber fisherman, right? And I remember when I was young, my dad would go with me. He wouldn't fish, but he'd sit on the lake shore and I'd pull up bluegill and sunfish and all sorts of small spiny fish that just hurt to take off the hook. And we would always try to catch the bass, and I didn't know how to fish for them, but I did know that everybody told me, like, if you want to catch the big fish, you have to go out at night. And so once I got old enough, my buddy, whose grandparents owned this little cottage on a lake, he would have me stay the night, and we'd go out in the middle of the night, and we'd go fishing just off the dock. And the biggest fish I ever pulled out of the lake were in the middle of the night. I remember one flopping around on the dock, and I'm trying to get the hook out of its mouth. It was probably like a 20-inch bass just on a worm and a bobber. And I'm thinking, I'm so excited at this point before it flops into the water, right? Like, this is the greatest it's ever been. And it's cemented in my mind, like, that's when you go fish. You do it in the middle of the night. Like, if you fish in a lake, you know that the fish are active. They're eating at night. Well, Simon, he's a fisherman. He knows this. He knows that's when you go fishing. You fish all night. You drag for the fish because that's when they're in those spots. Simon grew up in the area. He knew where the fish were. This is a family trade. He didn't get up one day and decide, hey, you know what sounds awesome? I'm going to be a pro bass fisherman. Simon just took over the family business. He said, this is what we do. I come from a long line of fishermen, and we fish. We have our boats. We have our nets at Lake Gennesaret. That's what we do. Simon just did what he was doing every single day, and now a rabbi shows up and says, hey, put out into the water. And also let down your nets. Now, I'd be thinking, like, is he hungry? What's going on? And that's how Simon answers. Master, we've been fishing all night. Like, I know how to fish. This is not the time to catch fish. But then I love his next statement. He says this, but because you say so, I will let down the nets. Because you say so, I will let down the nets. Scholar and Bible commentator James Edwards points this out. Two voices are audible in Peter's reply. The professional fisherman and the fledgling disciple. The man of this world and the man of faith. You see, I think Edwards points out a really good tension that's noticeable in Simon. Master, we've been fishing all night, but because you say so. But because it's an incredibly powerful statement. It's like, I know what is supposed to happen, and I'm not sure you know what's supposed to happen, but because you say so, I'm going to respond. In Simon is found both the professional fisherman and the tension of all of the things that he's heard from Jesus. Most assuredly, this is not the first time Simon has heard Jesus teach. Jesus taught in that area a lot, enough that he was drawing massive crowds down to the lake. Simon has most certainly heard Jesus teach. In fact, Simon's probably sat there and cleaned his nets many, many times before as he listened to this wandering preacher. But now something's different. Now Simon's being called to move beyond the listening, move to action, move to response. That's exactly what we see. But because you say so, I will let down my nets. There's a hope. There's something happening in Simon that is starting to shift for him. And we read what happens next in verses 6 and 7. So they do this, and they catch such a large number of fish that it starts breaking the nets. So much so that Simon has to call to his partners in business, James and John, and they tell him to get in that other boat that was right there when Jesus was teaching. He got into Simon's. There's another one there. That's James and John's boat. And so Simon calls to James and John. He's like, come on, we need your help. Like, look, our nets are breaking. Get out here. And so they do that, and they fill both boats so full that these boats begin to sink. Now, this is an incredible catch, well beyond what would be normal for fishermen in the area. This is a miraculous event. Scholars believe that the boats at the time were 15 to 20 foot long. Just shells. They were just made for people to stand in, throw a net, and bring in fish. And two of them being filled so full that those boats began to take on water. Now, I think if you were watching this from the shore, it's probably noticeable to anybody, but something unique is happening in Simon. He's been the one wrestling with Jesus. He's the one that had to put out into the water in his boat to accommodate this rabbi. He's the one who now has been told by the rabbi, you need to put out your net and you need to catch some fish. He's the expert. He's the one hearing Jesus. He's the one listening. And now Jesus has called him to respond. He does it, and something insane happens. And Simon sees it. When he sees it, in verse 8 we read this. He fell at Jesus' knees and says, "Go away from me, Lord. I am a sinful man." Now read back in the story. You're not going to find Jesus pointing out any flaws in Simon. That's not what Jesus does. He doesn't stand there and say, "Hey, you're so awful. You're so sinful. You need me." Like, if you've ever heard that from a Christian, or you've ever been that Christian, or you've ever received it from somebody, like, I'm sorry, that's not the attitude of Jesus. Sin is real. It's a real thing that we need to talk about, but that's not what Jesus leads with. In fact, I want you to catch this. Simon's, all of his interactions up to this point have never produced this kind of exclamation from his lips until this miracle of the fish in the boats happens. And then he falls at the feet of Jesus and he says, "Master, you have to get away from me. I'm sinful. You don't know my story. I'm sinful." Now, as far as we know, Peter isn't any more sinful than anybody else. He's just a regular guy doing a regular thing, going about his life. But after this encounter with Jesus, he's absolutely undone. He's absolutely cut to the heart so that it comes out of him, "I'm a sinful person. I've been about my own thing. I've gone my own way. I do what I want when I want." It's brought out of him by the encounter. Now, I do want you to catch the order of that, because it's not Simon's confession that leads to an encounter. Sometimes it's that way. Many times it's the encounter with Jesus that leads us to understand the truth about our lives. It's the encounter with Jesus where he does something insane in our lives, and then we just have to recognize he is different. And that's what Simon's realizing now. This is not a normal rabbi. Something else is happening. Somebody else is before me. In fact, the first time he says, "Master, we've been fishing all night." Simon approaches Jesus and he uses a title that's just a regular, everyday recognition of honor as a rabbi, maybe. It's not even the one he uses for rabbi. He just calls him master. He just respects him. But now he falls at Jesus' feet and he says, "Go away from me, Lord." The same word they would use for God in worship. He recognizes there's a divine moment happening. He's not just standing before a rabbi anymore. He's standing at the very least before somebody very significant who's representing God to him. Any other time you see this response from somebody in the Bible, they're usually before an angel or before the Spirit of God himself. And now he does it at the feet of Jesus. And he yells, "Get away from me, I'm a sinful man." In verse 9 and 10, we realize he's not alone. James and John have come out. He has other companions that are fishing with him as well. And they all together are watching what's going on. They've seen what's happening. They see Simon's confession where he cries out, "Get away from me, Lord. I'm a sinful man." And what I love most is what happens next. At the end of verse 10, Jesus looks at Simon and he speaks to him, and he doesn't look at Simon and say, "You know what, you're right, you are sinful, and you need to fix that." Right? Oftentimes I think that's the expected response we have when we go to God. Like, "God, I'm just so rotten, thank you for accepting me." And that's not Jesus' attitude toward him. It's completely unexpected. Simon falls at Jesus' feet, and Jesus responds this way, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you will fish for people." From now on, you will fish for people. Now, I think if I were Simon in that moment, I'd think, it's a weird thing to say, but we did just pull out a bunch of fish, so what the heck do I know? He's standing there. Jesus is standing there before Simon. Simon has this confession. Now Jesus looks at him and he says, "Don't be afraid. You were fishing for fish, and just as many of you as you've drawn into these nets, I'm going to send you out, and I want you to catch people." Now, if you grew up in church, like, you've probably heard this story a lot in Sunday school or in kids ministry or somewhere. You've probably heard this so much, but I don't think we always grasp the full extent of what's happening. I don't think we grasp Simon's response and then Jesus' reply to Simon's response, that he says, I'm going to send you out to catch people. Now, what is he sending him out to do? He's sending him out to join in the work of Jesus himself. Because Jesus' work has always been to catch people. Not to catch them off guard, not to catch them by surprise, not to catch them in doing something wrong, but catch them in his love. To catch them in his restorative embrace, to catch them in his Father's heart for them. To show them that there is more, that there is something different. And I'm not sure if Simon understands every single thing that Jesus is saying to him, but he understands enough that in verse 11 we see not just Simon's response, but everybody else's response to what Jesus says to Simon. And we read this in verse 11. So they pulled their boats up on shore, left everything and followed him. Everything. And when it says everything, we're not just talking about the fishing gear, and they followed him down the road maybe to grab a bite to eat and talk a little bit more. This is a signal that what they did was they followed the rabbi. This is more like a change of the entire way they lived life to learn how to live somebody else's way. That's what it meant to follow a rabbi. You learned how to live life their way. You followed in their footsteps. You did what they did. You ate when they ate. You slept when they slept. You learned how to teach the way they taught. You learned how to interact with others the way they interacted with others. That's the shift that's happening here. So Simon and all of his companions, James and John included, they leave everything behind. They leave their entire business. They leave the lineage of their family behind even. And they follow Jesus. You know, I don't know if they got everything that was going on. And in fact, if we read more stories about what happens with Simon, who becomes Peter, and James and John, and the rest of the 12 disciples, they rarely really understood what was going on. They rarely understood everything that Jesus was saying. They had to ask for explanations so many times, and they kept having assumptions about what Jesus would do, and Jesus didn't fulfill those assumptions, and they'd have to scratch their head. So I'd be really surprised if Simon understands what's going on. I'd be surprised if James and John understand what's going on right now. But they knew enough to get up and follow him. They understood enough to understand something about meaning and purpose when they encountered Jesus. And here's what happens when we encounter Jesus. An experience with Jesus, catch this, an experience with Jesus will redefine meaning and purpose in your life. An experience with Jesus will redefine meaning and purpose in your life. Now, I'm not assuming that anybody's sitting here this morning and saying, man, I'm just lost and I just need some purpose. Maybe some of us are, and that's okay. But I think most of us are just caught up in the everyday rhythms of life, and we're trying to do our best to find some level of meaning in what we do or who we are or wherever we go. I don't think that anybody's life that I walk around is inherently just meaningless. I think we all seek out meaning. It's the questions that we wrestle with. But here's what I do believe. I believe that the moment you have an encounter with the presence of God, the moment you experience Jesus for real, it will redefine all meaning, large and small, in your life. I don't think Simon was looking for meaning. His meaning in life was just to do what his father had done and his father's father before him. And maybe it went back for generations. Maybe they had maintained these nets and these boats and fished the same spots again and again and again. Simon's meaning was to do what was passed down to him, to be a good son, to take care of his family. Those are not meaningless works. Those are meaningful works. But Jesus comes along. And it's not until that moment that Simon falls at his feet and is completely undone, and Jesus redefines all the meaning of his life. All of those meaningful things, even the very career that he has, he says, you've been fishing, and that's been who you are, but I'm going to change the meaning of what you understand to be fishing. I think there's some of us in here today. That maybe you're in construction. Maybe you're a builder. I think that after an experience with Jesus, I wouldn't be surprised if he says something to you like, you've been building houses, but I'm going to teach you how to build lives. I think some of you are teachers. I know some of you are teachers. I wouldn't be surprised after an encounter with the presence of God that he looks at you and he says, you've been instructing young minds, and I'm going to teach you how to instruct people about my love. You see, that's what he does. He takes who we are and he breathes into it new meaning and new life after an encounter with him. It's been happening to people for centuries. The Bible, the collection of stories about God and his people, it is all filled with stories of people who have been radically changed by an encounter with the presence of God. And I have news for you. What happened then isn't just for then. If God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, there's good news in you for that. You today can have an experience, an encounter with Jesus that will radically define meaning in your life. That will make you come alive, that will take all that you are and show you the best possible version of that. And it's an invitation of Jesus that says, come follow me. And I'll show you that there's more. There's always more. There's more and more and more. That's what happens to us after an encounter with Jesus. We can find significance in meaning, not because life is devoid of it, but because there's more. And there's something that can only be found in the presence of God. I want to go over just briefly the pattern of Simon so that we can understand the pattern that he followed, and maybe there's something in it for us to learn in an encounter with Jesus. We've been talking about it all month, and I think this is really where it comes home. This is really where it comes to a head, and we're called to do something. The first step in having our encounter with Jesus is this. It's kind of more three postures, and the first posture is a posture of listen. Simon listened to Jesus. He listened to a lot of his teachings, and he was fine with it. I think when you listen to Jesus, when you hear the words of Jesus, there's something that's going to happen in you. There's something that's going to spark, just like we saw people come forward for baptism, and they weren't planning on coming forward because there was something happening in their heart. I believe that was Jesus. And when you listen to Jesus, something inevitably happens in you. Listening is the place that Simon started. He had heard Jesus so many times. But he stayed in that posture of listening. Now, what are you listening for? You're listening for that place in your heart that comes alive when you hear the words of Jesus. As Jesus speaks, there's something that's going to happen in you. There's a feeling, there's an urge, there's a desire that you're going to be drawn to. And those are moments that you need to pay attention. It's a moment that is ripe for encounter with Jesus. And it starts with listening. The problem for some of us who have grown up in the church or grown up in a life of faith is we stop at listen. Because there's more postures that we need to take. And the next posture is a posture of response. We need to respond. Simon had been listening to Jesus' instructions, but it wasn't until Jesus gets into his boat and Simon is sitting there with him and Jesus says, now put out into deeper waters and put down a net. It goes beyond Simon's understanding, but he has to respond to it. It's a response. It's that, well, listen, I know how fishing works, but because you say so. We've talked about response almost every single week because there's something powerful in it. Now, here's what happens. If we get stuck at response, there's a couple things that could potentially happen. If you get stuck at listen. If you get stuck at listen, there's a couple of potential things that can happen. The first one is you'll get used to what you hear. You felt that sense of God sparking something in you, but if you don't do something with it, you're going to start to sense diminishing returns around it, and you're going to start to think, is this all there is? And then you'll either get up and you'll go and find a new teaching that's new information where you can chase that experience again, or you'll walk away from it entirely. Those are the two things I see in the American church today. You're going to go off and you're going to find something, or you're going to walk away entirely. You're going to say, listen, Dan's been explaining this a lot, and he seems to repeat himself. I've already heard this. I don't know what else to do. I'm going to go find a new preacher. Jesus had one message. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Repent in response. You could treat those very synonymously. Those mean very similar things to one another. Respond because God is near. That was Jesus' message. And I would imagine that if people just listened and they didn't respond, they would eventually just start thinking, is this all this guy has? He's got like one message? Bring on somebody new. You see, because most of the time the encounter happens after the response. There's the start of it. There's a birthplace of an encounter that can happen in you when you hear the words of Jesus, when you sense that rising anticipation, that rising excitement. But then there's going to be a moment that you have to respond, and it might not make sense to you, but you have to respond. See, we have a saying that the grass is not always greener on the other side. Now that's true in a lot of life. That's true in a lot of relationships. That's true in most of life, I would argue. It is not true when it comes to Jesus. If Jesus calls you to something, I promise you, the grass is infinitely greener on the other side. But you won't know until you hop over. You won't know until you respond. And then after the response, there's one more posture that we see from Simon. It's that the response is that he falls down, he gets the boat out and he falls down at the feet of Jesus after the catch comes in and he cries out, Lord, get away from me. I'm not worthy to be in your presence. And then there's one more, that's the response posture. There's one more posture after that, and it's that they go. Simon and all of his companions, they get up and they go. They follow Jesus. They leave everything behind. And here's what I believe. I believe after an encounter with Jesus, he's going to send you. He might not send some of you far, but he will most certainly send you out of here. He will send you at the very least into the community, and you're going to start seeing the places that you go differently. You're going to start understanding that you have gifts and you've been created for a purpose, and you're going to start finding meaning every single place you go. And you're going to start to have to develop a posture of going, and you're going to have to realize that no matter where you go, Jesus is there with you, and he's calling you into meaningful work. He's giving you a redefined understanding of who you are in that place. For some of you, he's going to send you to different cities. For some of you, he's going to send you to different nations. Because that's what he does. Jesus said one time, he said this, pray that God would send more workers into the harvest fields because the harvest is plentiful, but there's very few workers. Jesus has always been desiring to send. And no matter what you do, no matter what work your everyday life is filled with, an encounter with Jesus will redefine all of the meaning of those activities, and he will send you. He might send you near, he might send you far, but you will understand that you now have a posture of going with purpose, going as a sent one of Jesus, and it will be unlike any encounter ever. There's a few people in Scripture that we could point to that have had encounters like this. Moses had an encounter with Jesus, or had an encounter with the presence of God in a burning bush in the book of Exodus. And before that, he was a murderer, and he tried to liberate God's people from oppression because he was one of the higher ups in the house of Pharaoh. But it didn't work out the way he thought, and so he was in exile, and he was a failure, and now he had a murder on his rap sheet. But he encounters God. And God redefines his meaning, and he says, no, you are a deliverer, but you're a different kind of deliverer. He's redefined. His shame is removed, and he encounters God, and it happens. You see, the most incredible thing about Moses is not that he parted the waters. It's that he met the presence of God and was redefined. And everything flowed from that moment. Another one, shortly after the life of Jesus on this earth, is Saul, who becomes Paul. He had a life of diligent service to the God of Israel. And then he meets God in the midst of persecuting the church of Jesus. And Jesus appears to him and he says, you've been zealous. I'm going to show you how much your zealousness will cost you for my sake. And Saul becomes Paul, and his life, his meaning is redefined from being a persecutor of the church to being persecuted because of the church. Even more recently, in the 1800s, there's a man named D.L. Moody, and he was a pastor in New York. And he had these two women in his church that were praying for him to have an encounter with God, an encounter with Jesus. And they told him that. And he said, I don't know what you're doing. They said, well, can we pray for you? We want you to have an encounter with Jesus. And he said, I'm a pastor. I teach you. And they said, that's fine, but we think there's more for you on the other side of this encounter with Jesus. He's like, that's fine, pray. And nothing happened in the moment, but then the next day he gets up and he starts going down Wall Street. And he's a pastor. He's going to go about his normal activities as a pastor. And all of a sudden, the presence of God falls on him. And he has an encounter with Jesus. It's so intense that he can't keep walking down the sidewalk anymore. And he goes to a friend's house and he spends over 4 hours in the friend's house in a room, locks himself in the door, and he starts crying out to God, God, you have to stop this, because there was so much of God's presence washing over him in a way that he could only describe as an overwhelming joy. He said, God, please stop, because I feel like I'm almost joyed to death. Is the words he used. He said, I felt like I was going to die because of joy. It was so intense. And after that, D.L. Moody went from a New York pastor that nobody has ever heard of to one of the greatest leaders of revival this nation has ever known in Chicago. Not because D.L. Moody became somebody different, but because he had an encounter with Jesus that redefined his mission and calling. And I'll tell you what, if D.L. Moody can have an encounter with the presence of God on Wall Street, you can have an encounter with the presence of God anywhere. That's what's available to you. That's what's more. And I don't know, maybe you've been longing for something more. I want to tell you, it's found in an encounter with Jesus. And I want to pray that over you this morning. Let's pray.